second presenter today is Dr. Jason Varner. In addition to being a former student of Anderson University, he also worked at AU as a resident director of Dunn Hall. And after completing his academic work here, he moved to Scotland to earn a Master of Letters in Early Modern History and a PhD in Modern History, both from the University of St. Andrews. He has also served as the Director of Community Life and Leadership Development at Warner University in Florida. His research interests include concepts of space and time in the early modern West and cross-cultural encounters between Europeans and the other. And his presentation is William Penn's Philadelphia, a case study in the formation of representational space in early modern America.
Henri Lefebvre's influential work, The Production of Space, has been celebrated across the spectrum of the humanities since it was published some 40 years ago. Philosophers, anthropologists, literary critics, even historians like myself have found in Lefebvre's work on the production of space a valuable framework from which they might approach their own varied research interests. At the center of Lefebvre's thesis is his unique trimodal concept of space, which asserts that space is produced through three overlapping fields. In the words of Lefebvre, translated from the French, these are the physical, that's Lefebvre, the physical, the mental, and the social. The physical field is referred to throughout Lefebvre's work as spatial practice, or the physical or absolute space that greets the individual, that presents itself to human agents. The second field, the mental, Lefebvre labels representations of space. These representations include the ways humans conceptualize the space within which they find themselves, as in, for instance, the making of maps or the naming of places, ways that we project our ideas onto space. Finally, Lefebvre refers to social space as representational space. This field describes the ways in which humans symbolically experience or give meaning to physical space, for example, through the sacredness of a church, a mosque, or even a cemetery. Our task today is to appropriate Lefebvre's spatial framework to the production of space in 17th century America. And to do this, we will be working specifically with the city of Philadelphia. Perhaps no other city in early modern America best illustrates, or better illustrates, this trimodal production of space than does Philadelphia. But before we dig in, a few additional remarks on Lefebvre's thesis are perhaps necessary. First, Lefebvre insists that the three spatial fields operate dynamically and in concert. That is to say, that space is produced by a constant ebb and flow of each of the three overlapping fields. So rather than assuming any kind of theoretical fixity, Lefebvre argues that each field is subject to contextual variables, and that these fields themselves are able to coexist, concord, or interfere with one another. As a result, no one area should be thought of as primary, despite the fact that Lefebvre does say that in our modern world, we've given inflated importance to conceptualized or represented space, our projections, our maps, our names, rather than space as it presents itself or symbolic space. A second significant qualification involves the relevance of the subject-object relationship to the production of space. Because Lefebvre's model is concerned with three modes of space, and because the production of space in any given context is dynamic, the subject and the object are bound up in a dialectical give and take. Let me explain a little further. The subject, or human agent, forms the objective space she lives in through the creation of representations like maps, or perhaps by giving names to something. But here, Lefebvre insists, the subject is perhaps equally impacted and shaped by the absolute space within which she finds herself. So the subject is in profound way shaped by absolute space. By way of example, historians have written a great deal on how the concrete presence of the Swiss Alps shaped the character of Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin, and therefore dictated to some extent the direction of the Swiss Reformation. The Swiss Reformation proceeded differently than did the Reformation in Germany, partly due, quite frankly, to the presence of the Alps. space-shaping experience. But that is for another paper. Today we turn our attention to the founding of the city of Philadelphia. And given the brief window of time we have together this afternoon, we'll be focusing in particular on the eschatological character of representational space, or lived space, in the founding of Pennsylvania's capital city. Now, a great deal of academic work has been devoted to the physical space that confronted William Penn and his agents as they arrived up to Delaware to begin land surveys for the new city. Finding a large tract of undeveloped, dry riverbank accommodable to seafaring ships was no easy task. Even more has been written on the representation of space in early Philadelphia. William Penn was a fastidious planner. Prior to his ever laying eyes on his chartered land, one scholar has noted that Penn, quote, worked through more than a dozen drafts of his founding documents and published no fewer than 7 editions of promotional materials in 3 languages, unquote, all before seeing Philadelphia. His skill and prominence as a municipal architect is evidenced by the fact that the gridiron layout Penn chose for Philadelphia has served as a model that is still highly favorable, or highly favored, I should say, by city planners even now in America. It all began with Philadelphia in the gridiron plan. However, the scholarship on the final spatial field, representational space, in early Philadelphia is far less substantial. In fact, what little work that has been done rarely takes on the issue of social or symbolic space directly. Andrew Murphy, for instance, has written an insightful article on the relationship between Penn's political theory and the practice in early Philadelphia, but issues that touch on social space, while present, are not the article's main concern. Most academic work, when it does address representational space, has simply rested on the happy notion of Philadelphia as a place that abounded in brotherly love, a simple way out. My research, however, indicates that representational space played a much larger and more complex role in the formation of Philadelphia than has been recognized. A careful reading of William Penn's papers from around this time reveal that he had grand expectations for his capital city, and that those hopes were clearly connected to Penn's belief that Quakers were living in the last days. In October of 1681, some 6 months after obtaining the charter for Pennsylvania from Charles II, William Penn wrote a letter to 2 of his administrators on the ground in the young colony. After addressing the treatment of Native American tribes and a few pressing business concerns, Penn turned his attention to the naming of his capital. "I do call the city to be laid out by the name of Philadelphia," he wrote, "and so I will have it called." That apparently is the formula to naming a city. Scholars have by and large focused their attention on the earlier parts of this letter, leaving the naming of Philadelphia to be read at face value. It's obvious, isn't it? He says it twice. The majority of those who do spend any time at all on the name are satisfied, along with the historian John Reps, to note that Philadelphia, when translated from the Greek, means, again, city of brotherly love. Gary Nash notably goes a step further, acknowledging that Philadelphia was the name for a city, quote, taken from Greek antiquity, unquote. But he fails to explain why this would have appealed to William Penn. Did Penn have brotherly love in the forefront of his mind when deciding on the name for the capital city? This would be a perfect name, after all, for a colony founded by a group that styled themselves as a society of friends. However, the evidence actually points elsewhere, to an eschatological foundation. In the book of Revelation, the city of Philadelphia is one of the 7 churches of Asia Minor that receive a letter from God through the Apostle John. And in these letters, each of the 7 churches is either condemned for their sin or commended for their faithfulness. Importantly, Philadelphia is one of only 2 cities, or 2 churches, portrayed in a positive light. Because of the church's faithfulness and endurance in the face of persecution, the Lord promises to bless the Philadelphians and protect them from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world. He then goes on to assure them that if they continue to persevere until the end, no one will be able to seize their crowns. What's more, they will be given, quote, the name of the city of God, the New Jerusalem that comes down from heaven, unquote. Now, evidence for an eschatological reading of the name Philadelphia begins with the fact that we know that Penn was thinking apocalyptically at this time. In fact, the millennial undercurrent in 17th century Quakerism is only now, receiving the attention in the academy that it probably deserves, and you see more and more written on the subject. Just 2 months prior to writing the aforementioned letter, where he named Philadelphia, Penn wrote a letter to the Quaker Thomas Janney expressing his hopes for his new colony. God will plant America, and it shall have its day. The fifth kingdom, or glorious day of Christ, in us reserved to the last days, may have the last part of the world, the setting of the sun, or western world, to shine in. Now, several eschatological themes stand out in this letter, but two are particularly provocative. The first is the phrase, fifth kingdom, which had strong millennial connotations in this area. Just 20 years prior, so-called fifth monarchy men had played an active role in the execution of Charles I, which they began, an act which they thought, would usher in the reign of the kingdom of God on earth. These fifth monarchy men. The fifth kingdom, or the fifth monarchy, is an image that comes from the prophet Daniel's interpretation of a dream told him by King Nebuchadnezzar. In his dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw 4 powerful kingdoms successively dominate the geopolitics of earth, but due to certain flaws, each of these kingdoms was thrown down. After these 4 kingdoms had risen and fallen, Yahweh would set up in the dream an eschatological 5th kingdom that was never to be destroyed and would in fact rule for all eternity. Penn's use of the term 5th kingdom here, particularly in light of recent revolutionary events in England, was strong, bold, and underscored his eschatological beliefs. Now, the second phrase from this letter that bears import for our purposes is the day of Christ. Any Quaker at the time would have readily associated this term with one of the central theological themes of Penn's mentor and the founder of Quakerism, George Fox. In his sermons and writings, Fox used this term, the day of the Lord, as a sort of shorthand for his millennial ideology. In the context of Fox's work, the day of the Lord took on 2 distinct meanings. The first meaning speaks to the present. An example of this can be found in Fox's letter to the King of Spain, in which he writes, quote, "And the day of the Lord's power is gone over thee, which is now risen. The morning star is now broken forth." The second meaning for Fox concerns the future. In a passage that clearly alludes to 2 Corinthians 5:10, Fox warns, quote, "The mighty day of the Lord is coming, wherein every one of you must give account of his deeds done in the body, and every man's work must be tried by fire, and man's work shall be brought to light and made manifest by it. So your day is not past. While you have time, prize it." What emerges here is a time between the times, a non-literal, metaphorical Quaker millennium between the 2 comings of Jesus. When read in light of the Daniel prophecy and the millennially charged phrase, day of Christ, the eschatological character of Penn's letter from August of 1681 leaves little room for confusion. Penn seemed to believe that the world was awaiting the final return of Christ, and that somehow his efforts in America would play a role in the unfolding drama. It is highly significant, then, that Penn named his capital city at the peak of his eschatological fervor. So far, the evidence is circumstantial. But there is one final document that directly links William Penn, Philadelphia, and the book of Revelation. In August of 1684, as he sat on board a ship preparing for his return to England, Penn wrote one final letter to the Quakers in Philadelphia. This letter from the Endeavor has generated quite a bit of commentary by historians of early Pennsylvania, and particular attention has been paid to the prayer of Philadelphia, or prayer for Philadelphia, that came at the end of this particular letter, something that's become famous in American studies. To the best of my knowledge, however, none of the scholarship has noted the strong ties between phrases in Penn's prayer and the letter to the Philadelphian church in Revelation. Fascinating similarities, however, exist in both the structure of Penn's prayer and his use of key phrases, and they draw parallels to the Revelation passage. Regarding structure, Penn begins his prayer by reminding the colony that much service and travail has gone into preserving them from such abuse that the world would defile them with. Now, this likely hinted at the persecution Quakers suffered at the hands of other Christians on both sides of the Atlantic. But it may in particular have referred to the Puritans of New England. The oppression experienced by Friends in Massachusetts Bay ranged from expulsion to whipping and culminated in the public execution of 4 Quakers between the years 1659 and 1661. Note that the first section of Revelation's letter to the Philadelphian church contains a similar reference to persecution at the hands of fellow believers or insiders, in this case, fellow Jews. Significantly, in both of these cases, the reminder of persecution precedes a promise that follows immediately in the texts. In Revelation chapter 3, verse 10, the Lord tells the Philadelphians, "Because you have kept my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial which shall come upon the world, to test those who dwell on the earth." God then exhorts the church to hold fast to what they have, that no one may take their crowns. And he promises to bless those who overcome. The parallels with Penn's letter to the Philadelphians are striking. His letter reads, "Oh, that thou may be kept from the evil that would overwhelm thee, that faithful to the God of thy mercies in the life of righteousness, thou mayst be preserved to the end. My soul prays to God for thee, that thou mayest stand in thy day of trial, that thy children may be blessed of the Lord." Now, this passage echoes the conditional blessing of Revelation 3:10-12. Penn is concerned that the modern Philadelphians persevere to the end, that they might stand in the day of trial so that they might receive the blessing he believes is theirs. Finally, it is really telling that Penn employs the phrase day of trial. John, in the biblical text, employs a very similar phrase to symbolize an undefined period of testing that will come in the last days, the hour of trial. It should come as no surprise, given the importance of the day of the Lord motif in early Quakerism, that Penn substitutes the word day for hour here, invoking the same imagery along the way. He has taken a famous apocalyptic trope from the book of Revelation and imbued it with a particularly Quaker character. By employing references to persecution at the hands of other believers, the acknowledgement of divine promise or reward, and then the use of the eschatologically charged phrase, day of trial, William Penn effectively weaves together the American Philadelphia with the Philadelphia of the book of Revelation. Now we now turn to the larger task of this paper, which is to assess the role of eschatology in the production of space in early Philadelphia. To understand the significance of a shift to an eschatological reading of the evidence, it is necessary to recall the traditional narrative briefly. Historians like Bert Struthers have long insisted that the name Philadelphia, quote, meant just what it said. The green country town was to be a place where everyone loved each other and behaved better than anyone had ever behaved before, unquote. For these scholars, the primary force in the establishment of social space in Philadelphia was the creation of a tolerant zone, a place where Quakers and other dissidents were able to enjoy religious freedoms and more perfectly live out their Christian calling. Penn, this narrative suggests, grew weary of the persecution Quakers were facing in England and decided that the only way forward was to found a new society based on egalitarian principles where peoples of all walks could live in harmony. But this traditional narrative fails on at least 2 accounts. First, the establishment of a separate place where Quakers could openly practice brotherly love free from persecution runs counter to the very principles of early Quakerism itself. Fox and his followers believed that the bearing of persecution offered critical opportunities for the message to spread. Furthermore, it also provided confirmation for their millennial expectations. The saints in the book of Revelation suffered persecution prior to Christ's return. The fact that Quakers too suffered in expectation of the final day of the Lord served as a sort of vote of confidence. Second, even if we do accept the argument that Pennsylvania was established to promote toleration and provide a space wherein Quakers could practice their brotherly love, this would have hardly been a revelation. Rhode Island, as well as both the East and West Jersey plantations, already offered the toleration that Pennsylvania now promised. In short, there was simply no need, or to put it more crudely, no market demand for a colony of this sort. These needs and demands were already being met, despite what you might have heard in your high school history classes. What then was the point? Henri Lefebvre insisted that representational space, is alive, it speaks. In the case of Philadelphia, then, what does it say? Well, I think it says a number of things, but I've only got time to comment on one, I'm afraid. William Penn was not ultimately driven to forge a colony in the wilderness so that people would have a place to get along. I think that says more about the wishes of our contemporary age than it does about our early modern subjects. Instead, Penn seems to have been animated by a genuine desire to create a space that was charged with eschatological meaning and purpose, a place that would finally validate the Quaker way of being in the world, and a place that would serve as the spatial representation of Daniel's fifth kingdom in preparation for the final coming of Jesus Christ. But did it happen? Well, yes, and ultimately then no. For the first 30 years of its existence, I would argue that this eschatological mission did permeate the space in and around Philadelphia. As we close, I'd like to submit just two pieces of evidence to support this claim. First, early decades of Quaker settlement in Pennsylvania were marked by a respect for Native Americans that was simply uncommon in the colonies at this time. Penn refused on several occasions to enter into business agreements whose terms were unfavorable to Native American neighbors. Additionally, he refrained from using the technology of writing against local Native tribes whose cultures were entirely oral. Rather than demanding that land and fur trading deals be established through written contract alone, Penn was careful to respect the oral culture of his neighbors, insisting that all contracts be read aloud and in the indigenous language of the people. And they were to be reread at regular intervals to honor the Native American way of keeping agreements. While violent conflict with Native communities was a regular part of life in Puritan New England, the historian Frederick Tolles has remarked that it is, quote, one of the miracles of history that for nearly 75 years after colonization, Quakers lived in peace with their Indian neighbors, unquote. Now, the second piece of evidence I would submit is that Penn notoriously hovered near bankruptcy during the first 30 years of the colony's founding. He simply refused to enter business and land agreements that would jeopardize his vision of a peaceable kingdom. The granting of fur trading monopolies, long a source of revenue for colonial governments, was outlawed by Penn. He did not take advantage of fur monopolies. What's more, he also failed to efficiently collect the quit rents due him by settlers on his chartered land. This has bothered historians of Pennsylvania for generations. How could Penn have been so bad at doing business? Perhaps in the end, Penn's investment in Pennsylvania wasn't primarily financial, but eschatological. Perhaps his desire was not to found a colony that worked, but rather to establish a colony that would hold fast and earn its crown. After all, for Penn, it was more than the eyes of the world that were upon the colony. If indeed the day of the Lord had arrived, the real eyes that mattered were those belonging to a God who sat in judgment. Thank you.